Hi, I'm going to give a presentation on a project that I've been working on for a number of years now with UN Habitat and other collaborators. And it's a new version of the pattern language book that I think many of you are familiar with. This time it includes a companion wiki, which is editable and able to be modified to fit a specific project and to do some other things that I'll describe. So we think this is very exciting stuff. I mentioned that this is a partnership with UN Habitat, and I think some of you are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement of a few years ago, and also most relevant for us in the urban field, the new urban agenda. And that's a big deal because new urbanism or walkable mixed-use urbanism, whatever you want to call it, has been enshrined in international policy now, adopted by acclamation by all 193 countries of the United Nations. And of course, implementation is still a huge challenge, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. But what you'll see if you compare the new urban agenda with, for example, the charter of the new urbanism, is a lot of point-for-point agreement. And you'll see, for example, on the issues of polycentrism and the issue of compact, walkable, mixed use, and I'm not going to read through all this text, by the way, but you'll get the idea. The importance of public space, not just as an amenity, but as a network that runs throughout the city. The importance of multimodal streets and transportation for walking, bikes, and transit, as well as the car. Buildings that shape and define and connect public space and are connected to each other by public space, very important and very different from, say, the landscape urbanists or other sort of modernist urban practitioners. Also, the regeneration of historic patterns, not only for the value of cultural heritage, but also because sometimes the most sustainable solutions are, in fact, provided by heritage. And it's important for us to be able to use those resources without bias against the solutions of the past. Also using open, connected urbanism, Jane Jacobs urbanism, if you will, to advance diversity and equity and capacity building. And finally, public involvement and co-production. Of course, not only the formal public involvement processes, but informal co-production where the citizens are actually building and modifying and contributing to the many different scales of urban space and urban structure. So these are all really impressive achievements, but the looming question is how to implement the new urban agenda, the agenda of new urbanism, if you will. And the New Urban Agenda has a section at the conclusion talking about the importance of building platforms for peer-to-peer learning and for open, user-friendly, and participatory data exchanges. And as many of you may know, one of the most successful and widely used examples of this kind of platform is, in fact, the wiki, Wikipedia, and so on, we're all familiar with. But less well known is that the wiki technology was itself the direct outgrowth of the pattern language methodology described on Wikipedia, which is its best known example, as a method of describing good design practices or patterns of useful organization within a field of expertise. So pattern languages are not just useful in the built environment. In fact, they have become much more influential in the software world, for example, where the use of pattern languages of programming or design patterns has become a ubiquitous methodology used in almost every game nowadays, in, as I said, in Wiki and Wikipedia, many other forms of Wiki, and in operating systems like the Mac and so on. So it's a very, very common methodology for the design of computer software, but you can see pattern languages in many other fields as well, in fields like biology and in anthropology, even in physics, and so on and so forth. So it's become a very robust and widespread design methodology. But that begs the question, why pattern languages haven't been more useful in the built environment world? And I have some ideas about that, one of which is that the book itself has become such a classic that has really constrained development. Another is that we haven't yet applied some of these new computer-based methodologies to pattern languages. And so that's an exciting opportunity that we wanted to address directly and do something about that. So many of you know the structure of pattern languages. I'm sure I'll just briefly mention each pattern is a kind of cluster of design elements that are related to each other in a particular way. It begins with the name of the pattern and usually an iconic photo, upward hyperlinks to the patterns at a higher scale, a problem statement, an analysis of the problem, and then a diagrammatic conclusion of some kind, and then finally downward hyperlinks. And that's the structure of each one of the patterns. Then those patterns are interrelated with each other in a kind of network at different scales, and those form a kind of relational structure, forming what Alexander refers to as a pattern language. And in a sense, you can decompose any design problem into a hierarchical structure, as the great Herbert Simon pointed out in his great paper, The Architecture of Complexity. They're nearly decomposable hierarchies, as Simon observed. And Alexander observed that too, that there are these overlapping web-like relationships that he said form semi-lattices, or they form web network structure. And because of that structure, you're able to isolate clusters that you can then usefully manipulate as objects within this larger network. And these are essentially the patterns. This was the work that he did in his seminal Notes on the Synthesis of Form, his first book. And then later on, he took that methodology and developed it into the pattern language concept, where you can actually manipulate the patterns independently, or relatively independently, and you can begin to create useful design networks that way. And then you can design at many different scales as well. So to take a simple example, if you think about the pattern door, essentially a door is a configuration of elements with each other, right? You've got the hinges on one side, you've got the knob on the other side, and that configuration is important. You want the knob to be on the opposite side from the hinges. If it was on the same side, you wouldn't be able to open the door. So the pattern is that configuration of elements in a certain relationship. And then, of course, that pattern fits into another pattern. So the door fits into the pattern of a room where there are other doors, for example. And then the room fits into larger patterns still, the pattern of the house or the building, and so on and so forth. So it's important to be able to work with those patterns at many different scales and link them together into larger structures, which is an important capability of pattern languages. So what we wanted to do with this new project was really begin a much bigger expansion of the number of patterns beyond the original 253, and also to take them into new areas, new kinds of patterns, and then of course to take them into the realm of software with the wiki. And I'll take you through some of the examples of that. Just to give you an example of the format, with the print version, we stayed pretty close to the original pattern language format, where you have, again, a title, an iconic photo, upward hyperlinks to higher scale patterns, a problem statement, a discussion section or an analysis, and then finally a therefore statement and a diagrammatic conclusion. And below that, downward hyperlinks to smaller scale patterns as well. And then one other feature that's very important for us here was to include research citations. The whole idea of patterns is that this is an evidence-based approach to design, to have evidence for different kinds of design solutions. And if there's other evidence that emerges, then fine, you revise the pattern or you discard the pattern, but it's evidence-based. If somebody else comes along and says, I don't like your pattern, then you say, okay, show me the evidence. I'll modify my pattern, or I'll agree with you, I'll adopt your pattern. Again, putting things on an evidence-based footing instead of on an ex cathedra footing of ideology and so on has been too much the case lately. So just to give you a sense of some of the different kinds of patterns, there's the polycentric region. Again, some of the patterns that are common to the New Urban Agenda and the Charter of the New Urbanism, walkable, multi-mobility, mixed use, and so on and so forth, the usual sort of urban design patterns, if you will. But also there are different kinds of patterns here that reflect new kinds of challenges, challenges for retrofit and informal settlements, suburban patterns, and so on and so forth, urban regeneration. New kinds of implementation patterns, different tools and strategies, different organizational patterns of subsidiarity and governance and so on, different kinds of legal mechanisms and ownership mechanisms to promote affordability and so on. And then finally, of course, new kinds of technological patterns, citizen data, the ability to use web tools and so on and so forth, which is very important here. And then, of course, the wiki repository, which is a very important aspect of this project to be able to take not only the original patterns that we wrote, but many, many more patterns that other people could write and share and modify and so on, and greatly expand. So the wiki repository means that you can add many more patterns, you can edit them, you can adapt them to different contexts, you can share them across different contexts from different cities, different countries, different users. The patterns can do new things. They can pretty much do whatever the technology allows you to do, like make numeric calculations, make field measurements, do augmented reality, virtual reality simulations, function as apps. Any kind of technology that you can get on an app, you could probably do as part of a pattern. And you can create federated collections that can be shared as whole clusters with other groups of people, and they can transform them and use them and then share them back. That's the idea of federation. And Ward Cunningham, who was the original inventor of Wiki, has been really a fantastic collaborator on this project. He's the one who developed the new federated technology and is the one who helped us to develop this Wiki repository. Ward has been using the new federated wiki technology to do all kinds of interesting new things. Here is a sustainability rating system that he developed for Nike, where you can plug in the data for different kinds of materials that you would be using as a shoe designer, for example, and get the sustainability metrics for that particular design. I use that same methodology with Ward's great help to develop a scenario modeling tool for urban design, where you can do different simulations of different variations in density and transportation and so on, and get different predictions of, for example, greenhouse gas emissions and other metrics that could be a very useful and important tool for scenario modeling, for user-friendly wiki-based scenario modeling. So the federated wiki that we're using here has the ability to navigate pretty easily between the patterns. And if you go onto the website, you can play with it and enjoy navigating between the different patterns and seeing how they work together and the different tools that Ward has developed to visualize the network of relationships. And you can play with it online. It's just npl.wiki or npl.wiki. Just enter that into your browser window and you can play with it and you can see how it works. We're still adding capabilities, the ability to edit and to federate and do other things, but you'll begin to see how it's working and where we're headed with this. And I hope to get your comments and your feedback, your involvement. We're very excited by this project, as you can tell, and we welcome your feedback and involvement. Thank you.